Have you ever looked at a map and simply trusted it? We assume that the lines, the cities, the very nations they depict are real. But what if a country, complete with its own flag, currency, and capital city, was nothing more than a story? What if hundreds of people sold everything they owned to emigrate to this promised land, only to discover upon arrival that it did not exist and never had? Our story begins in London, in the early 1820s. The Napoleonic Wars were over, and a wave of speculative fever gripped the nation. Fortunes were being made and lost on ventures in faraway, exotic lands. Into this optimistic, greedy, and gullible society stepped a man who seemed to embody the very spirit of adventure. His name was Gregor MacGregor. He was a tall, dashing figure with a powerful presence and a hypnotic charm. He claimed to be a Scottish clan chieftain, a decorated veteran of the British Army, and a hero of the Venezuelan War of Independence, where he had fought alongside Simón Bolívar. He carried himself with the air of command and the grace of nobility, a man whose stories were as grand as his ambitions. In 1822, MacGregor made a stunning announcement in the drawing rooms and coffee houses of London. He was not just a Scottish laird, he was the cazique, or prince, of the independent nation of Poyais, a sovereign state located on the Mosquito Coast in Central America, along the Black River. He claimed the native king had generously bestowed the land upon him. MacGregor didn't just describe a piece of land, he painted a picture of a utopia. Poyais, he explained, was a paradise of breathtaking fertility, with soil so rich it could yield 3 maize harvests a year. The rivers, he whispered, were flecked with gold, the forests filled with valuable timber. It was a land of opportunity, a blank canvas for a new, prosperous British colony. He described the capital city, St. Joseph, in meticulous detail. It was no jungle outpost, but a thriving port with a domed cathedral, a magnificent opera house, paved streets, and elegant European-style villas. He spoke of a functioning government, a well-organized army, a friendly Anglophile native population eager to trade, and a climate that was, he assured everyone, remarkably healthy. To legitimize his claims, MacGregor embarked on one of the most sophisticated marketing campaigns the world had ever seen. He published a 350-page guidebook, complete with detailed maps and geographical surveys. He gave extensive interviews to major newspapers, which reported his claims as fact. He even had ballads and songs written about the glories of Poyais, sung in the pubs of London. This wasn't a simple investment scheme. It was a nation-building enterprise. MacGregor opened a Poyasian legation office in London and began selling land certificates at 4 shillings per acre. He offered positions in the new country's civil service, army, and banking system. He was not just selling land. He was selling a new life, a new identity. He also managed to secure a £200,000 loan, the equivalent of tens of millions today, on the London Stock Exchange by issuing Poyasian government bonds. He even began printing his own currency, the Poyasian dollar, featuring his own portrait. The detail was staggering, the audacity breathtaking. To the London elite, Poyais was as real as France or Spain. The people who bought into the dream were not just greedy speculators. They were doctors, lawyers, skilled tradesmen, and entire families. They were people displaced by the end of the long wars, seeking a fresh start in a land of promise. They sold their homes and businesses in Britain, liquidated their assets, and poured their life savings into this new paradise. In September 1822, the first ship of settlers, the Honduras Packet, set sail from London with around 70 hopeful immigrants. They were followed in January 1823 by the Kennersley Castle, carrying another 200 souls. Imagine the atmosphere on those ships, the hope, the excitement, the hymns sung on the deck as they sailed towards their new home and their guaranteed fortune. After a grueling 2-month voyage, the Honduras packet arrived at its destination. The settlers, dressed in their finest clothes, gathered on the deck, straining to catch their first glimpse of the capital city of St. Joseph. But as they drew closer to the shore, their excitement turned to confusion, and then to a slow, creeping horror. There was no bustling port. There was no domed cathedral, no opera house, no paved streets. There was nothing. Before them lay only an impenetrable, swampy, malarial jungle. The capital city was a handful of decaying, abandoned huts. The friendly natives were nowhere to be seen. They had arrived at a place that existed only in the pages of a book. The ship's captain, following MacGregor's orders, unloaded the settlers and their provisions onto the desolate beach and promptly sailed away, leaving them stranded. The reality of their situation began to sink in. They were thousands of miles from home, with dwindling supplies, in a hostile environment they were utterly unprepared for. The paradise was a lie. The second ship, the Kennersley Castle, soon arrived, depositing another 200 victims into the same nightmare. The settlers were ravaged by tropical diseases, primarily malaria and yellow fever. Starvation and despair set in. The dream of Poyais had become a death camp. People began to die, one by one, their bodies buried in shallow graves on the beach. Their salvation came in the form of a passing ship from a British settlement in Belize. The crew was horrified to discover the skeletal, disease-ridden survivors. A rescue mission was mounted, and the remaining settlers were evacuated. Of the approximately 270 people who had sailed for Poyais, more than 180 had died. By late 1823, the first survivors began to trickle back to London. Their emaciated appearance and their horrific stories of death and deception caused a sensation. The newspapers that had once celebrated Gregor MacGregor and his paradise now condemned him as a monster. The greatest fantasy of the London Stock Exchange had collapsed into its greatest scandal. And what of the cazique himself? When confronted with the stories, MacGregor displayed an audacity that was almost supernatural. He dismissed the reports as vicious lies, a smear campaign orchestrated by his enemies. He claimed the settlers had been lazy and ill-prepared, and that their suffering was their own fault. He even had the gall to place new advertisements for Poyais. But the tide of public opinion had turned violently against him. With the authorities closing in and his investors demanding his head, MacGregor knew the game was up in Britain. He gathered his vast fortune, abandoned his Poyasian legation office, and fled to France, leaving a trail of financial ruin and human tragedy in his wake. One might assume that his career as a con man was over. But in Paris, Gregor MacGregor did something truly unbelievable. He started the exact same scam all over again. He set up a new Poyasian office, published French editions of his fraudulent guidebook, and began selling land and government bonds to a new, unsuspecting audience. He found a fresh pool of French investors and managed to convince a new ship of settlers to embark for his fictional paradise. The French authorities, however, were eventually alerted by their British counterparts. In December 1825, MacGregor and his associates were arrested just as the new vessel was about to set sail. The subsequent trial in Paris was a spectacle. MacGregor, ever the master performer, played the role of a wronged visionary, a noble leader whose grand project had been sabotaged by lesser men. He charmed the court, and in a stunning verdict that defied all logic and evidence, he was acquitted. His accomplices, however, were convicted. He returned to London, where the Poyasian loan was now in default, and the bondholders were clamoring for justice. He was arrested and briefly imprisoned, but the legal system of the time struggled to prosecute his unique crime. How do you convict a man for misrepresenting a country when he hadn't technically broken any specific laws against it? After his release, he He attempted to launch several more smaller-scale scams, but his name was now too infamous. His magic had faded. The great cazique of Poyais was reduced to a common swindler, his reputation in tatters. His time in Europe was over. In 1838, Gregor MacGregor made his final move. He sailed to Venezuela, the country where his reputation as a genuine war hero was still intact. He presented himself to the Venezuelan government not as the disgraced Prince of Poyais, but as General MacGregor, a hero of their revolution. The Venezuelan government, remembering his real military service from 2 decades earlier, welcomed him with open arms. He was granted Venezuelan citizenship, confirmed as a divisional general, and awarded a handsome pension for his services to the nation. The ultimate con man had found his final, perfect sanctuary. He lived out the rest of his days in Caracas, a respected and celebrated figure. When he died in 1845, he was buried with full military honors in the Caracas Cathedral, a resting place for the nation's most revered heroes. The man who had swindled hundreds and caused the deaths of nearly 200 people died a celebrated hero. The legacy of the Poyais scheme is a chilling testament to the power of a convincing story. MacGregor didn't just sell bonds, he sold a narrative. He understood that in a world hungry for hope and profit, a well-told fantasy could be more powerful and more valuable than the truth. His crime was a murder committed not with a weapon, but with a printing press. His victims were killed by the gap between a beautiful, detailed map and a harsh, unforgiving reality. He created a national delusion, a collective hallucination built on paper and promises. The scheme's success reveals the danger of social proof. When respected banks, newspapers, and influential people all buy into a story, it becomes incredibly difficult for ordinary individuals to question it. The belief of the crowd creates its own reality, even if that reality is built on nothing. MacGregor was a genius of psychology. He understood that his investors didn't want to do the hard work of due diligence. They wanted to believe in a shortcut to paradise. He gave them exactly what they craved, a story that was too good to be true, but too beautiful to doubt. Unlike Charles Ponzi, whose scheme was purely financial, MacGregor's con had a tangible, physical component. He convinced people to uproot their entire lives, to journey across an ocean based on his word alone. It was a fraud that targeted not just the wallet, but the soul. His story serves as a bizarre and unsettling historical footnote. A man who invented a country, who was responsible for the deaths of so many, ultimately escaped true justice and died a celebrated hero. It's a conclusion that feels deeply, profoundly wrong. And so, the Phantom Nation of Poyais leaves us with a timeless question. The tools of deception have changed, from printed guidebooks to sophisticated websites and virtual worlds, but has human nature. In an age of misinformation, how can we be sure that the promises we are sold, the realities we are shown, are not just a modern map of a country that doesn't exist?